right, if it's all right with everyone, I'd like to go ahead and get started. First, I'd like to welcome you to the Baker Institute. My name is Regina Buono. I am the Baker Botts Fellow in Energy and Environmental Regulatory Affairs. I should say that 3 times fast. I would like to thank you for coming. It is fantastic to see so many people interested in this topic. This is the second in a series of talks on climate change policy that the Center for Energy Studies is hosting. And it will culminate with a paper with recommendations sometime early next summer. The subject is very timely today. As many of you know, the talks in Lima are wrapping up in preparation for the climate treaty negotiations in Paris next year. And it is my pleasure today to introduce our speaker. Megan Ceronsky is the Director of Regulatory Affairs and a Senior Attorney at the Environmental Defense Fund. She, as a member of EDF's domestic climate and air legal team, works to secure clean air and to support climate change mitigation. Today, Megan is going to talk about the framework of the EPA's Clean Power Plan and the options that are available to states as they work to create their compliance plans. Megan's going to talk for 25-30 minutes or so, and then she's agreed to take questions. And so if you'll hold your questions till the end, we'll have people circulating with microphones. And so with that, if y'all will help me to please welcome Megan Ceronsky.
Oh, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It is wonderful to be here, so thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the kind introduction, Regina. What she neglected to mention is that we went to college together, and therefore she has all kinds of stories that I was anxious about her sharing with you all as an introduction to this speech. So thank you, Regina. We'll provide some sort of payment later. I'm Megan Ceronsky. I lead EDF's work on the Clean Power Plan at the federal level, and in that work on sort of thinking through policy design questions, legal questions, and then do a lot of work with states and power companies thinking about implementation. And there are a lot of different things to talk about in the context of the Clean Power Plan. A week and a half ago, we filed comments that were 237 pages in length with several attachments. And so I am happy to talk about whatever you want to talk about today. But I was going to start with sort of a bit of an overview about what this thing is and how we got here and what are some of the more interesting questions to think about going forward towards implementation. And then in the Q&A period, we can dive into whatever you want. And at lunch, I was asked if I was going to talk about the legal questions, which I speak about frequently. Since this is not, I presume, an audience entirely of lawyers, I was going to save you the legal questions. And so if any of you want to talk about them, we can talk about them in the Q&A section. But then whoever asks the question will bear the blame for the fact that we will then be talking about the legal questions. It will not be my fault. So the Clean Power Plan. This is a section of the Clean Air Act, Section 111, which directs EPA to set nationally consistent performance standards for sources of dangerous air pollution. And that goes for all dangerous air pollution and all sources that are major contributors to an air pollution problem in the context of new sources. But in the context of existing sources, this part of the Act is only used for pollutants that are not addressed under the ambient air quality sections of the Clean Air Act or under the hazardous air pollutants sections of the Clean Air Act. So it's basically a backstop, catch-all provision for when you have pollutants emitted by existing sources that are not covered elsewhere under the Act. And what the Act says is it directs EPA to identify what is called the best system of emission reduction, BSER, which is adequately demonstrated, considering cost, to address that pollutant from that type of source. And that's pretty much all it says. Those words are not defined in the statute. And then once EPA identifies that best system of emission reduction, they also identify the emission reductions that are achievable if you were to deploy that system. And then that level of emission reduction becomes the standard that state plans must meet. But states actually put in place these standards on their sources and don't have to use the system of emission reduction which EPA has identified as best. They can use any system of emission reduction they want as long as they get to that level of environmental performance. So it's a federal-state collaboration where EPA identifies what they think is out there, they set the emission limitation levels, and then the states go about designing their plans and putting in place standards on these sources. So in the context of greenhouse gas emissions and existing power plants, the agency was faced with kind of an interesting question here, right? Because if you think about, traditional, you may not think about this, I think about these things all the time. If you think about traditional Clean Air Act standards, right, you've got a pollutant, you've got a source of that pollutant. Often you have some sort of a widget that you can put on the end of a pipe or even somewhere upstream in between two pipes, or there's some sort of mechanical intervention that you can make at the source to capture some or all of that pollutant or convert it into something that is less damaging. In the context of greenhouse gas emissions and power plants, it's harder to think about what that is, right? So we have carbon capture and sequestration, which is not yet widely deployed and is quite expensive. And then you have, that's sort of your widget option. But what EPA did in this context is they looked around at what states and companies are actually doing. And states and companies across the country are having tremendous success in reducing carbon pollution, but they're not doing it through widgets. They're doing it by deploying renewable energy, they're doing it by investing in demand-side energy efficiency, and they're doing it by shifting utilization from the highest emitting generating sources towards lower emitting generating sources, and to some degree by improving the efficiency of specific power plants. And they can do that because the electricity grid is uniquely integrated. If we think about the grid, there's this tremendous amicus brief that was written for a FERC proceeding, which I just got to read recently and was one of the things we actually submitted to EPA with our comments. And it explained to me for the first, I've been working in energy and climate policy and law for like 8 years, and I never really fully understood this till I read this brief, but the electricity system is actually one giant machine where you have generation of energy, which is then, is agitating electrons, which are agitating the next electron next to them, and then that's agitating the next one. So you're basically energizing this massive grid, and then folks who are pulling power off of that grid are pulling effectively the waves, if we get back into quantum physics, pulling the waves of energy off of that system, which means that you're balancing supply and demand on an instantaneous basis across that grid. And so if you're putting cleaner sources onto the grid where you're generating electricity, then you're backing off, you can back off the dirtier sources. And so because the grid is completely integrated, this is how you can effectively reduce carbon pollution and do so cost effectively. So that's what EPA identified as the best system of emission reduction. They said the best system of emission reduction is made up of 4 building blocks: heat rate improvements at coal-fired power plants, shifts in utilization from existing coal-fired power generation to underutilized natural gas generation in a state, deploying renewable energy and keeping nuclear energy around, and then deploying demand-side energy efficiency. And so that's what they said was the best system. And then they applied that system to each of the states. Well, each of the states that actually has fossil fuel-fired generation. There's one that does not. And then came up with a state target. And that state target is an average emission rate that the state has to meet between 2020 and 2029. So it's a 10-year averaging period. And then there's a 2030 number that has to be met going forward. So that's the framework that EPA proposed on June 2nd of last summer. And now we were in the public comment period, which just wrapped up a week and a half ago, and they'll be coming out with the final standards next summer. And so it's interesting to think about in that context, what do you do if you're a state and you're looking at state implementation? And EPA has laid out a number of different possibilities in this context. They have said that states can build on their existing policies, so their existing clean air and energy efficiency and renewables policies, and basically add up, they call this the portfolio approach, they can add up a series of different policies, and by adding them all up, get to achievement with the standard. So you could think about a state saying, we've got our renewable energy standard, we've got our energy efficiency program, we are going to retire, we know we're going to retire this specific plant in 2023, we're going to shift utilization from some of our coal plants to some of our gas plants, and through that combination of measures, we can show you how we're going to get to our emission rate over time. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is to put in place a trading program. Now, I work for Environmental Defense Fund. We are very intensely focused on market-based mechanisms because we think in the right circumstances you can use those to get to the environmental result you want more cost-effectively. So we're kind of excited about this idea. So there are two different market-based mechanisms that EPA laid out that states could consider. One, I'll start with the easier one actually. One is a mass-based trading program, commonly known as cap and trade. Those words are not used very often because sometimes they're not very popular, but that is effectively what a mass-based trading program is. So in that context, the states can take their rate, convert it into a budget, distribute that budget amongst their sources however they want, and then the sources get to trade the allowances. And each source turns in an allowance for every ton that it emits. And because the allowances are trading among themselves, you end up getting to the budget at the end of the day, and you're assured compliance with your plan. And because they're trading in a market, you hope that you're getting to the most cost-effective emission reductions possible. Now, in the context of that kind of a plan, one of the advantages is you're investing in energy efficiency, you're investing in renewable energy, but you don't have to quantify the effects of those because they'll just show up in reduced emissions at the sources that are turning in the allowances. So the more you're using energy efficiency, that means you're using the coal plants and the gas plants less, and so those plants will need fewer allowances, and that will help you get to compliance at the end of the day. Similarly, with demand-side energy efficiency, if you're investing in energy efficiency, demand is going down, you're running plants less, they're going to need fewer allowances. I would say one caveat on that system, if you look at the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a group of 9 states in the Northeast that have put in place a cap and trade program for their power plants, they've seen some really interesting results because they are auctioning off these allowances to the regulated sources, and so the states are getting in this revenue, and they've spent that revenue differently, which has created, from an academic's perspective, a perfect case study, because you can look at what's happening in the different states that are making different decisions with what to do with this revenue. And the states that have invested that revenue back into energy efficiency, I should say all of these states are experiencing significant economic benefits in the context of this program, but the ones that are investing the allowance revenues back in demand-side energy efficiency programs are seeing even more of an economic stimulus effect as utility bills are coming down for citizens, and then they're spending that money on other things and creating a local economic stimulus effect, as well as the jobs of the energy efficiency program. So they're seeing sort of the most efficient policy process being the cap and trade combined with a revenue stream going into demand-side energy efficiency. And demand-side energy efficiency, slight tangent here, is an interesting challenge in this context because we've all known forever that investing in demand-side energy efficiency is by far the cheapest way to reduce pollution from the power sector. And it has all of these co-benefits, right? People's houses are warmer or cooler. To remember that I'm in Houston, and more comfortable. Business places are more comfortable. Businesses are more efficient and more competitive. But it's been like this holy grail out there that it's always been hard to get to. We've known energy efficiency has this great potential, but we've just never really been able to capture it. And I think one of my great hopes in the context of the Clean Power Plan is that EPA, by making demand-side energy efficiency a formal compliance pathway with a federal clean air standard may finally shift some of the incentive structures such that folks will really be energized to overcome some of the barriers to really getting at energy efficiency potential, and that we can really start to invest in that resource and get all of the benefits that accrue because of it. So that's a mass-based trading program. That's one of the options. Another option would be to do a rate-based trading program. And so in this context, you can think about each of the fossil fuel-fired regulated sources in a state having an emission rate that it has to achieve. And it can meet that rate by running less, by reducing its own emissions, but also by investing in and taking credits that represent renewable energy and demand-side energy efficiency. And so the rate you get at the end of the day is not its actual emission rate, but a rate that reflects the fact that it's holding credits representing emission reductions from renewable energy and demand-side energy efficiency and from shifts in utilization between coal and gas plants. So again, you've got a market structure that can allow you to make sure that you're getting the most cost-effective emission reductions at the end of the day. Slightly more complicated than a mass-based approach because you have to quantify the emission reductions that are being achieved by the demand-side energy efficiency investments and by the renewable energy, so that you sort of added on a step, which is doable, but it is another step to get those credits into the system. But again, at the end of the day, by creating a market, you should be creating more cost-effective emission reduction opportunities. So those are sort of the three main frameworks that EPA has laid out for states to think about. One of the additional complexities and opportunities here is, of course, to think about the potential for multi-state compliance. One of the challenges with working under the Clean Air Act and this section of the Clean Air Act is that it is a state-based framework. And the electricity grid is, other than in Texas, not state-based. So for the rest of you all are going to have a slightly easier time here, but for the rest of the country, and even in Texas, there are, of course, multi-state implications of the electricity grid. But you have ISOs and RTOs operating over many states, organizing power delivery across multiple states and portions of states. You have ISOs and RTOs that are operating, you have some states that are divided between 2 or more RTOs. And you know that the potential for cost-effective emission reductions is also different across state lines, and that power companies own units that operate across state lines. And so one of the things that EPA has said in this proposal is we want to encourage multi-state compliance here. We can't give you a program that mandates it, because this is a state-based program under the Clean Air Act. But we want you to, if you can figure out how to do it, please do so. And so one of the options that the agency has laid out in the proposal is for states to put together joint plans and to say, we 3 states are going to work together, we've combined our emission reduction responsibilities, and we are jointly going to comply, which is a great framework. And I think the regional greenhouse gas initiative states in the Northeast will do that. The challenge, of course, is you have to get 3 states and probably 3 state legislatures and governors and all of these folks to agree on one single pathway going forward. And I like to fancy myself a political pragmatist, and sometimes that doesn't seem so likely, at least not in sort of the short term. And so what is the sort of second best option to think about if we're not going to get to, at least not immediately, a lot of regional frameworks sort of popping up across the country, maybe not right at the very beginning. And so one of the things that folks have been talking about, and I actually got this idea from a rural electric co-op that operates across states that are very diverse politically, and they really want to be able to manage their compliance across state lines, and they really don't think that the governors and the legislatures in some of their states are going to be very conducive to sort of creating one of these multi-state frameworks. And so the idea they had was, what if you can just put in place a really simple trading program of the type that I've been talking about, that is a rate-based trading program or a mass-based trading program in the states that it's not a joint plan, but they take similar approaches. So let's say, and again, it's easiest to think about this just conceptually from a mass-based perspective, but let's say 2 states next to each other both put in place a mass-based program. It's permit-based. The sources have to have an allowance for every ton that they emit. And then the regulations in each state just say, we will accept an allowance that we have issued or that this other state has issued. Or you could even say that any state taking a mass-based approach with an approved EPA plan has issued. And then suddenly you have the potential for a market across state lines for those states without having to have this sort of giant agreement across those multiple state political jurisdictions. So that's one idea. You could do the same thing with the rate-based trading program. Again, you have to make sure you have sort of consistent treatment in terms of the creation of the credits that represent the emission reductions driven by energy efficiency or renewables or shifts in utilization. And in the context of two states with different rates, you have to take into account the fact that they are operating under different emission rates as their state targets. So it's a little more complex, but again, something that you perhaps could do. So these are sort of some of the key broader sort of policy design questions that are being wrestled with right now by stakeholders across the country and by EPA as they think about how do we put this program in place and finalize regulations that will hopefully empower states to be able to do the things that they want to do and enable really good policy making on the ground. So just taking a step back as I wrap up and move into the Q&A section, which folks have promised me will include discussion of all of the legal issues. This is exciting. We have, for the first time ever, national standards on carbon pollution from the largest source of carbon pollution in our country. And we've been waiting a very long time for this to happen. And the agency, I think, has taken a very hard look at ways in which they can do, under the Clean Air Act, a framework that will enable as much state flexibility and innovation and smart policy design as possible. At the end of the day, it is up to the states what approach they take, but I think EPA is trying its best to enable sort of cost-effective, market-sensible, regulatory approaches that can create a consistent carbon signal on the power market so that you're getting an efficient outcome at the end of the day, and at the same time, allowing states to design their programs to maximize co-benefits for their states. As we're reducing carbon pollution, we're also reducing the other pollutants that are emitted by power plants, and those co-pollutant reductions are going to, have tremendous benefits for the citizens in each of these states. EPA is projecting a 25% reduction in the pollutants that cause smog by 2030, and due to those reductions alone, for every dollar that's invested in Clean Power Plan compliance, we'll see at the back end $7 worth of health benefits for Americans, which is just tremendously exciting. These benefits will be $55 to $93 billion a year in 2030, and include avoiding 2,700 to 6,600 premature deaths, and 150,000 asthma attacks a year. So this has the potential to be really transformative in terms of putting a signal into the power markets that can transition towards cleaner generation, reduce emissions not just of carbon, but also of other harmful co-pollutants, and hopefully deploy energy efficiency in a way that will be more meaningful and more reflective of the true potential of that resource. EPA's analysis indicates that if states do significantly deploy energy efficiency, you could see an 8% reduction in utility bills by 2030 as those measures take effect and folks are receiving the reductions in utility bills that result. So I will stop there and open up the floor to questions, but thank you again for having me.
I actually have two questions in one, if I may. First one, who is going to be responsible for mothballed power plants? And second question, is anything going to be done for very old power distribution system?
So I missed one of the words in your first questions.
Who is going to be, what agency or business is going to be responsible for mothballed power plant. For the mothballed, like moth,
Mothballed,
like a
thank you.
flying insect. Mothballed, sorry for my accent, it's Russian.
No, it's
Okay.
wonderful.
Mothballed power plants, and is anything going to be done at some point in the near future about very outdated old power distribution system, which
Right.
is also very inefficient?
Right, right. Great questions. So the question of mothballed power plants, one of the interesting things about the Clean Power Plan is that it is coming at a time of great dynamism in the power sector, where we are seeing really significant shifts in power generation away from what has traditionally been, predominantly coal as baseload power generation in this country, to a real mixture of coal and gas, driven predominantly by low natural gas prices, as well as aging coal plant infrastructure, and the fact that coal plants are now, under the mercury and air toxic standards, finally required to control their toxic air pollutants. And so for older plants, it's not making sense to invest in pollution control devices at this stage in their lives, and so they're retiring. So we're seeing this time of great dynamism that is just, it's truly historic. And so I think the hope is that the Clean Power Plan, both by providing a long-term carbon signal, this plan goes until 2030, and by providing this, really significant flexibility to states in terms of both having a 10-year average for compliance, as well as having all of these different compliance options, because they can comply however they want as long as it reduces emissions. I'm sorry?
It wasn't my question. You know what mothballed is? The ones that are retired.
Right.
What is going to be done with them, and who's responsible for either demolishing them or...
Oh, demolishing them. Oh, right. Interesting. I think so just to finish my thought, so the fact that you have a lot of flexibility and a consistent signal will allow states to continue to operate plants where they need to or want to as replacement generation is being developed and transmission, and then to retire them when it makes sense. Once they are retired, the responsibility for dealing with those plants, I believe, and this is not my area of expertise, so take it for a guess, would still rest with the owners of those plants, and the sort of takedown, addressing any sort of dangerous pollutant obligations would, be under other sets of environmental laws. This plan doesn't have that component about what you actually do with as you're taking down plants. Maybe someone else in the audience actually knows what happens to coal plants as they're being dismantled. If you do, please let me know. But to switch to your other question about just, power distribution systems and their age, another exciting thing under the Clean Power Plan is there are investments that you can make in technologies to make power distribution more efficient that also reduce emissions. So voltage variance regulation, that where you're putting in place investments on the transmission that allow you to know with much greater sensitivity whether you're getting power to the furthest end of the line and how much power you need to be on the line to get it there, and to sort of moderate the voltage on the line. I've now reached the end of the complete limits of my understanding of how this works. But the fact that you can invest in that and then use less power going in to get to the result at the end of the day means that you can have a more efficient and a smarter power distribution system, and collect emission reductions by doing that. Everything that we do in terms of making power usage smarter, that can get credited through the demand-side energy efficiency compliance framework. So I think there is potential under this framework. As long as it's reducing emissions from a power plant, you can count it in your plan. So it creates an opportunity for exactly the kinds of investments you're talking about.
So you spoke about the EPA's estimates of how much lives could be saved, health effects, and monetary values of those benefits. Those are coming from other air pollutants, not from the 30% reduction in CO2, and how much air pollution benefits we get would depend on which of these 4 building blocks is used and which coal power plants end up reducing their emissions. So what are the best ideas that you're hearing out there of trying to maximize the air quality co-benefits that end up coming from the way this actually gets carried out?
Right, that's a great question. At the end of the day, that is going to be a question that gets answered by each state. And so as the states are designing their plans, I already know that many states are thinking specifically about specific pollution sources that they may want to address as a component of achieving compliance with this plan, and by doing so, making sure that they're getting those co-pollutant emission reductions. And I actually think that there's an interesting tension there between taking that kind of an approach or leaving it up to a market-based plan where you aren't going to know going into it what path the market is going to effectively choose for compliance, or what companies are going to choose when they're faced with the market signals that the plan puts into place. So that, states may choose between the portfolio approach and a market-based approach based on whether they want to, have control over specific decisions that are made about specific pollutant sources. I think another idea that's been laid out is for the states to include, as they're designing their plans, to do some modeling of what the air pollution effects the co-pollutant emission effects would be of different plan designs and different decisions. Certainly to the extent that we can invest in renewables and demand-side energy efficiency, we're getting the maximum reductions in pollutants at the end of the day. And so that is going to make more sense as we're thinking about it from that health-based framework, and for that matter from a long-term carbon perspective. But I think it's a really great question, but to some degree, because folks have been focused on the national standards, it's a question we're just beginning to explore in the state level conversations.
Right here, Texas has more wind turbines than any other state. Can you tell us about the subsidy they get? I understand that each of these turbines cost over $1 million. Tell us about the subsidy and how viable they are, say, without the subsidy.
So I assume you're talking about the production tax credit that wind generation receives. And again, we're getting out of my area of complete expertise, and the topic of subsidies is a very tangled one, given that the federal government, in its wisdom, has seen fit to subsidize all different forms of energy generation for many decades, and just getting to the bottom of who is subsidized at what level is actually a very challenging mathematics exercise if you're looking through the different tax credits and the treatments that different sources are getting. So the production tax credit, I think, is it in the package of extenders? I haven't actually checked yet. Does anybody know? That just went into the omnibus? It is. So that will probably continue for a few years. It's been very interesting to see in the last several years a number of companies, including some of the power companies in Texas, investing in solar and wind because the fuel savings, because the fact that once these things are built, you don't need to pay for any fuel going forward, is producing so much savings for their customers that it's more cost effective than the alternatives, the fossil alternatives, which is the first time we've seen that going forward. So I think the hope is that with continued investment, as these technologies are sort of reaping the benefits of greater scale of production and use and more knowledge about how to make them more cost effective. The taller wind turbines would be one example of that. That those prices are going to come down even further, and we'll see even more cost effectiveness in terms of capturing renewable potential.
Yeah, so one of the things with the higher penetration of renewables is you get into things, you get challenges with grid management, grid reliability, and all that. So what would you say is the biggest challenge with, would grid management, grid reliability, and proper grid integration have to move hand in glove in order for these renewables to really make an impact?
Yeah, I was actually just talking with some of the senior staff at the PUC yesterday about exactly that question. And Texas is leading the way on this question, right? Texas has more wind on the grid than any other state. And so what Texas has done to manage exactly what you're talking about is invested in transmission so that you have greater connectivity across the grid and you can manage these intermittent resources. Another thing that helps is if you have intermittent renewable resources of different types and in different locations across the country, because if the wind goes down somewhere, it's probably coming up somewhere else. One of my dreams is like offshore wind down the eastern seaboard connected by a massive transmission line, because then you'd have massive and stable power, because you'd have the sort of, you'd be covering the different areas of where you're sure to get sort of wind in a more consistent manner. So I think that's part of it. I think one of the areas that has just lagged behind in a really unfortunate way is storage. Energy storage is just the nut that we have not cracked yet. It's just really hard to store energy. And you're seeing some really interesting investments going into that now in terms of pumped air storage in Texas and elsewhere. Battery setups, there's a really large battery storage device that's at one of the wind farms in Texas, and the batteries are getting better and better, in part because of the electric vehicle infrastructure investments, but also just because our understanding of these technologies is evolving. There have been a couple of studies that are worth looking at about greater integration of wind, one in the MISO territories and one in PJM, that have been within the last, I think, 6 months or so, that have looked at, significant increases in renewables penetration and whether or not they could manage those. Both of those studies found that they could manage them with some sort of reasonable investments in transmission. So I think that is part of the answer, but that's going to be a challenge that we're going to continue to face going forward. And if any young, smart engineers in here, if you're going into energy storage, that would be awesome, because we need better answers.
Hi, I had a question. Hi, Megan. My name is Saida Hassan. I'm a reporter with Houston Public Media. We recently had ERCOT, the company that manages Texas's power grid. We had an interview with them, and they mentioned that due to these new regulations, they'd have to shut down half of their coal-burning plants, which they said would result in higher energy prices as well as potentially rolling blackouts. What is your response to that? And you touched on some of those alternative energy sources, but could you expand more on what you see as the Texas solution?
The Texas solution. I don't know that I would be so egotistical as to have the Texas solution, but a few thoughts on that. The ERCOT study was interesting. I think one of the things to think about in the context of it is it was a static study. So it was assuming that we aren't building new generation, which we are building. And so the question going forward is how do you manage these questions? Grid reliability is absolutely essential, right? We are not going to be doing anything that is going to disrupt reliability going forward. Happily, we've been implementing the Clean Air Act since 1970 and have never caused any reliability problems, but it is something that folks worry about consistently, as they should, going forward. I think one of the benefits of the Clean Air Act framework that EPA has put forward in the Clean Power Plan is that you do have a 10-year averaging period, so you have the time and the space to decide what you're going to do with specific units and to manage any reliability issues that might otherwise arise. And again, this is going to come back to state plan designs, but it's not just state plan designs, it's also looking at state plan designs in combination with other state plan designs, right? Because these are interconnected resources, and so we need to make sure that the states are sufficiently coordinated that any potential reliability issues are, identified early on and addressed going forward, so that you don't have any of the rolling blackouts that have been predicted many times before and never come to pass. So I think it is about responsible planning at the state level and making sure that states are taking full advantage of the flexibility that's provided in this framework.
Some of us that are industrial users of electric power also generate our own power and make contributions back to the grid. And sometimes it's even locally significant in terms of volume. Do any of the efficiencies that we try to do in reduction of emissions play into this framework at all, or how does that work out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the basic it's actually very simple in the way that EPA put it forward in the proposal. If you're reducing emissions from the regulated sources, then it counts towards compliance. And so to the extent that you have CHP going in or operating in an industrial context, and it is providing that efficiency and you're reducing emissions overall, then that counts towards compliance. So again, it's just figuring out how to count it, but if it is having that effect, then it counts.
The intent is that could be of some help to the state. Okay.
Yep.
We don't seem to have gotten to some of the legal issues, so just in case anyone's interested. I guess Professor Tribe has recently provided some comments, which I thought were amazingly vituperative in nature. I was surprised at the tone of the comments. And his argument, I think, in a nutshell, is one, these facilities are already regulated under other parts of the Act, so there's no statutory authority to do that on the part of EPA. And in addition, he was very critical of the economic benefits analysis, as was mentioned here, and you also pointed out that in this section of the Clean Air Act, they are required to consider that. So I just was hopeful that you might comment on those legal issues.
Sure. So for folks who missed this, Larry Tribe put into the record comments. He was paid by Peabody Coal Company to offer some comments on the legal foundation of the Clean Air Act. And it's also worth noting that Larry Tribe has offered comments or been engaged in legal activity around clean air standards previously. On that side of things, and his comments, his interventions have never led to a change in the actual statute. He's never won in these court proceedings, but his arguments on the Peabody comments were, I think, they were interesting. They were certainly new. I hadn't, we've been engaged in legal debates around these standards for 3.5 years now, and he came up with some new things that I had not heard before, which were very, very interesting. I think the idea that, one of the ideas he put forward is that this is somehow novel to be addressing one pollutant from a source when other pollutants from that source are being addressed elsewhere, and that's just not correct. Under the Clean Air Act, we address different air pollution problems under different parts of the Act when they're tailored to those different pollutants, and the power sector is already subject to different sets of standards as a result, because different sets of standards address different types of pollutants. He also made a takings argument, which is an area of the law that basically says you can't steal someone's property without compensation, which is a very important thing. But addressing dangerous air pollution under the Clean Air Act has never been considered a taking before of private property. It's been considered the framework that Congress put in place to make sure that we're addressing these air pollution problems over time. There's a very interesting response to Larry Tribe's comments by Ricky Revesz, Dean Emeritus of NYU Law School, that was published in The Hill, that is worth looking at as a rejoinder.
Yes, hi. So thank you for the comments. So I was interested when I first read the proposal that it only deals with carbon dioxide and doesn't deal with any other greenhouse gases, particularly methane. So it gives an advantage to, say, natural gas over some other sources. Do you think that's going to change, or what is EDF's view on that?
It's a great question. This is a part of the Act where you generally deal with one pollutant at a time, and in this context, what EPA is addressing are combustion emissions from power plants. And what that ignores, as you very rightly point out, are methane leakage emissions from natural gas production and transmission, which in some of these production fields are clearly massive, because if you do the tall tower sampling or the flyover sampling, you're seeing just very, very high levels of methane leakage. And because methane is so much more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2, that means you're not getting the environmental benefit in terms of carbon at the end of the day by switching from coal to gas. It also seems clear from the research that EDF has done, one, that it's very possible to very significantly reduce methane leakage quite cost effectively from the extraction and transmission processes, and also that these massive leaks that you're seeing in some of these fields, as far as I can tell, are coming from certain very large leaks rather than from everybody, right? There's sort of significant variability in the, you have some folks in this industry who run very tight ships. And where you're running really tight ships, you can keep methane leakage low. But the fact that we're seeing these large levels means that there are big leaks somewhere that we haven't quite identified yet. So we need to identify those. There are other parts of both the Clean Air Act and other authorities at the federal level that are available to address methane leakage, and we have been advocating strenuously for the administration to take up its responsibility under those other authorities and address methane leakage from both new and existing sources. They took a first step on some of the new sources under the Clean Air Act, but we need to capture the existing sources and really get at the heart of that problem, because you're right, it's irrational otherwise to be pretending like that leakage isn't there. It's a really big problem. And
Okay,
air problem. Sorry.
We're going to go ahead and make that our last question. I'm sure Megan will be happy to stick around for a few minutes if you guys want to talk with her after. But let's go ahead and thank Megan.